Hey guys. Settle here. Tonight, we begin not with cheering crowds, but with silence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because before the triumphal procession entered the city of Rome, before the laurel crowns were lifted, before the incense smoke curled into the pale sky, there was anticipation and calculation. The Roman triumph is often remembered as a victory parade. A general returns. Enemies defeated. Treasures displayed. The people rejoice. But that description is incomplete. The triumph was not simply a celebration. It was a warning. To understand that, we must slow down. We must walk the route step by step. Imagine the early morning. The city is already awake. Citizens crowd along the Via Sacra. Children sit on rooftops. Vendors whisper of spoils from distant lands, gold from Asia Minor, armor from Gaul, silks from the East. But this spectacle is not spontaneous joy. It has been approved, carefully. Only the Senate can grant a triumph. And the Senate does not grant lightly. The general requesting it must meet strict conditions. A significant victory. Thousands of enemy dead. A war concluded. But beneath these official requirements lies something more subtle. A triumph is permission for a man to appear almost king-like inside a republic that fears kings above all things. Rome expelled its last monarch centuries earlier. The republic prides itself on shared power. No crowns. No thrones. No permanent rulers. And yet, during a triumph, a single man rides in a chariot through the heart of the city dressed like Jupiter himself. That contradiction is the key. The triumph is controlled monarchy, temporary, theatrical, and supervised. As the procession begins outside the sacred boundary known as the Pomerium, the army assembles in formation. Behind them are wagons stacked with spoils, statues, weapons, rare animals, captured banners. Then come the prisoners. Foreign leaders in chains. Nobles from conquered territories. Sometimes entire families. They walk, not hurriedly, but slowly, deliberately. The crowd sees the cost of resistance. The message travels faster than any legion. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. And then comes the general. Standing tall in a chariot drawn by white horses. His face painted red to resemble Jupiter Optimus Maximus. In his hand, a laurel branch. Behind him, a slave holds a golden crown above his head and whispers. Remember, you are mortal. Even in triumph, Rome reminds its victor of limits. That whisper matters. Because the triumph is not just a message to enemies. It is a message to the general himself. You are powerful. But only for today. Above him rise the temples of the Capitoline Hill. At the top waits the temple of Jupiter. The route is intentional. The general does not end at his home. He ends at Jupiter's altar. He sacrifices. He gives thanks. He attributes victory to the gods, and therefore to Rome. Not to himself. This redirection protects the republic. Because Rome has a long memory of men who grow too popular. Too admired. Too indispensable. The triumph celebrates victory. But it also contains ambition. It transforms military success into civic ritual. It channels personal glory into state-sanctioned symbolism. Without that ritual, a victorious general might march his troops into the city uninvited. With it, he enters peacefully, applauded, observed, and ultimately dismissed. The day ends. The laurel crown is removed. The painted face washed clean. The general returns to being a citizen. At least in theory. But theory bends over time. As Rome expands, triumphs become more frequent. Bigger wars. Bigger spoils. Longer campaigns. More loyal armies. And loyalty begins shifting. Not to the Senate. To the commander. This is where celebration becomes warning in another sense. Each triumph signals to rivals. This man commands legions. This man commands wealth. This man commands public affection. The people cheer. The Senate calculates. Other generals watch. Because a triumph increases political capital. It translates battlefield success into votes, alliances, influence. And Rome's political system is intensely competitive. The triumph is advertising. It is branding. It is proof of dominance. Consider Julius Caesar. His triumphs after the Gallic Wars were unprecedented in scale. Gold flooded the city. Prisoners paraded in numbers never before seen. One triumph lasted multiple days. The spectacle dazzled. But beneath the awe lay anxiety. If one man could conquer Gaul, command unwavering loyalty from legions, and return to Rome adored by the masses, what remained of republican balance? The triumph did not cause the fall of the republic. But it revealed its fragility. The ritual designed to contain ambition now amplified it. And this is the paradox. The triumph was built to stabilize Rome. It displayed strength externally. It disciplined generals internally. It unified citizens through shared spectacle. Yet over time, the scale of empire made those victories too large to contain symbolically. Power, once theatrical, became structural. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he did not request a triumph. He came with an army. That crossing marked the moment when ritual could no longer manage ambition. The Republic trembled. Civil war followed. Eventually, Rome would no longer pretend to fear kingship. Under Augustus, the title of king remained taboo, but the power returned in new form. Interestingly, Augustus was cautious with triumphs. He allowed others to celebrate them, limiting his own. He understood what they represented. A triumph magnifies a man. And in an empire with a single ruler, magnification is dangerous. So the ritual changed. As emperors consolidated authority, triumphs became imperial ceremonies rather than competitive political tools. The warning shifted direction. No longer warning generals. Now warning the world. Look at Rome. Look at its wealth. Look at its power. Resistance is futile. Yet even then, the whisper remained, remember you are mortal. Because mortality is the ultimate equalizer. Emperors died. Dynasties fell. The triumphal arches remain. Stone monuments inscribed with victories. Silent witnesses to a ritual that once balanced celebration and control. If you stand today beneath the Arch of Titus, you can still see carved reliefs of spoils from Jerusalem. The menorah carried high. The procession frozen in marble. It looks triumphant. But it is also instructional. It teaches submission. It encodes hierarchy. It immortalizes conquest. The Roman triumph was never just joy. It was choreography. A lesson. A display. A boundary. It reminded citizens of Rome's dominance. It reminded enemies of Rome's reach. It reminded generals of Rome's authority over them. And when that balance failed, the Republic ended. So as the sun sets on our slow walk through this ancient ritual, imagine the crowd dispersing. Dust settling. Chains removed from prisoners destined for darker ends. The general alone in his home, paint washed away. Was he satisfied? Or did he already hunger for more? That hunger, controlled, celebrated, feared, shaped Rome's destiny. Because the triumph was not simply about victory. It was about who owned victory. The man. Or the state. For centuries, Rome insisted the answer was the state. History suggests the answer was more complicated. And in that complication, the warning still echoes. Celebrate power carefully. Because spectacle can strengthen a republic. But it can also expose how fragile it truly is. And that is where tonight's long procession truly begins. The procession has ended. But the echo has not. Because what makes the Roman triumph so enduring is not the noise of the crowd, it is the structure beneath the noise. Let us return, slowly, to the beginning of the ritual itself. In early Rome, triumphs were rarer. The Republic was smaller then. Wars were closer to home. Victories were important, yes, but they did not yet reshape continents. A triumph required negotiation. The general waited outside the city walls while the Senate debated. That waiting was deliberate. A commander with an army could not cross the sacred boundary of Rome while still holding military authority. To do so without permission would signal threat. So the general camped outside. Armed. Victorious. Popular. And technically barred from entry. That image alone reveals the tension. Rome feared its own success. The Senate had to balance gratitude with caution. Approve the triumph, and you elevate the man. Deny it, and you risk resentment, perhaps rebellion. This was political theater before the curtain even rose. When approval came, it did more than authorize celebration. It transformed private military power into public civic ritual. The army, which normally could not enter the city in full strength, marched in formation. But they marched as part of ceremony, not as a conquering force. Symbols matter. The difference between invasion and parade is choreography. Now consider the order of the procession. First, magistrates and senators. Then trumpeters. Then wagons filled with captured wealth. Paintings depicting battle scenes. Models of conquered cities. Placards listing the names of subdued peoples. This was visual storytelling. Many citizens would never travel beyond Italy. The triumph brought the empire to them. It mapped geography onto imagination. It showed forests of Gaul, deserts of Africa, rivers of the East, all symbolically folded into Roman control. It was education through spectacle. And education shapes loyalty. When citizens see abundance flowing into their city, they associate conquest with prosperity. Bread becomes cheaper. Games become grander. Public buildings expand. The triumph quietly argues. Empire benefits you. But woven into that promise is a warning. The conquered leaders walking in chains were not anonymous. They were named. Recognizable. Some had once negotiated with Rome as equals. Now they walked beneath Roman gaze. Often, after the procession ended, those leaders were executed quietly. Not in the public square. Not in spectacle. The spectacle had already done its work. The execution was administrative. Rome did not merely defeat enemies. It demonstrated irreversible hierarchy. There is something else, something subtle. During the procession, soldiers were allowed to sing. Not solemn hymns. Sometimes mocking songs about their general. Teasing verses about his flaws, his vanity, even his scandals. This, too, was ritualized. It prevented the general from appearing too divine. It reminded everyone, including him, that he was human. Mockery becomes protection. A society that allows laughter at its heroes avoids worship. Or at least delays it. But delays are temporary. As Rome's wars grew larger, generals spent years away from the city. They developed personal bonds with their troops. Shared hardship. Shared danger. Shared reward. When those soldiers marched in a triumph, they did not only celebrate Rome. They celebrated their commander. Loyalty becomes personal when distance from home becomes long. And Rome's empire stretched very far. Think again of Julius Caesar. His campaigns in Gaul lasted nearly a decade. An entire generation of soldiers knew no other commander. When they returned, they did not simply respect him. They trusted him. The triumph amplified that trust into public adoration. Crowds cheered. Debts were forgiven. Games were sponsored. The general distributed gifts. Popularity is powerful currency in a republic. And the triumph minted it efficiently. But here lies the danger. If a general could secure devotion from both army and populace, what role remained for the Senate? The Senate could grant honors. But it could not command affection. That imbalance widened. Eventually, civil war did not begin with a triumph. It began with refusal. When Caesar was denied the political future he desired, he chose force over ritual. The Rubicon crossing symbolized a breakdown of negotiation. The system designed to contain ambition had lost its leverage. And yet, even after the Republic's fall, the imagery of the triumph endured. Under Augustus, triumphal symbolism became centralized. He constructed monuments. He inscribed victories in stone. He allowed others limited honors. But ultimate glory pointed upward, toward the emperor. The ritual that once balanced competition now reinforced hierarchy. No more rivalry among equals. Now supremacy of one. It is fascinating how quickly meaning can shift while appearance remains similar. The crowd still gathered. The arches still rose. The laurel wreath still rested upon brows. But the warning changed direction. Under the Republic, the triumph warned the general, do not overreach. Under the Empire, it warned the world, do not resist. Same ritual. Different audience. This transformation teaches something profound about political symbolism. Ceremonies are flexible. They survive regime change. They adapt to new power structures. They look ancient even when their meaning evolves. And that adaptability is why the Roman triumph echoes through later history. Napoleonic parades. Imperial processions. Modern military displays. The choreography feels familiar. Victory is rarely displayed quietly. It is staged. Not only to celebrate the past, but to shape the future. Because when a state performs power, it strengthens belief in its inevitability. And belief is stabilizing. But belief can also blind. Let us slow again. Imagine standing in the crowd. You see chained prisoners. You see wealth. You see your city radiant. You feel pride. But do you also feel fear? Perhaps a little. Because the power that crushes foreign kings could, in theory, crush internal rivals too. Rome walked a delicate line. It wanted citizens proud. Not terrified. It wanted generals honored. Not worshipped. It wanted enemies subdued. Not endlessly rebellious. The triumph was designed to balance all three. For centuries, remarkably, it worked. That is the quiet brilliance. Not that it eliminated ambition. Not that it erased conflict. But that it ritualized it. It gave ambition a stage. It gave conflict a script. And scripts are safer than chaos. Until they are not. As the empire expanded beyond easy management, as wealth disparities widened, as military loyalty personalized further, the triumph's balancing act became fragile. Ritual cannot indefinitely restrain structural imbalance. Eventually, the structure shifts. But the memory of the ritual remains. Even today, the word triumph suggests joy. Success. Celebration. We rarely think of it as caution. As containment. As psychological messaging. Yet in Rome, it was all three. And perhaps that is the final layer to uncover tonight. The triumph reveals that states understand something deeply human. People need stories. Victory must be narrated. Power must be visualized. Ambition must be staged. Without narrative, power feels unstable. With narrative, it feels ordained. The Roman triumph told a story. Rome is destined to rule. Its generals are instruments. Its gods approve. Its enemies fall. Its citizens prosper. But embedded within that story was a reminder. No individual stands above the state. At least, that was the intention. History, as always, complicates intention. And so we continue our slow walk, not through noise now, but through reflection. Because the Roman triumph was never just a parade. It was a mirror. Held up to the Republic. Reflecting both its strength, and its vulnerability. And as long as we keep walking, there are still more layers to uncover. Let us move even slower now. Because beneath the marble arches and the cheering crowds lies something quieter, something almost administrative. Paperwork. Deliberation. Debate. Before a triumph ever reached the streets of Rome, it existed as a political argument. A general did not automatically receive one. He petitioned. He justified. He counted enemy dead. He presented spoils. He argued that the war was legitimate, decisive, beneficial. And the Senate examined those claims carefully. Why? Because granting a triumph was not merely rewarding success. It was granting visibility. Visibility creates reputation. Reputation creates leverage. And leverage shifts power. So when senators debated whether a commander deserved a triumph, they were not only measuring military outcomes. They were measuring risk. Is this man stable? Is he ambitious? Is he aligned with our faction? Does he owe us favors? Politics moved beneath the ritual like roots beneath stone. Sometimes, triumphs were denied. And denial carried consequences. A disappointed general might hold a lesser celebration called an ovation, entering the city on foot rather than in a chariot. Symbolism mattered. A chariot signified supreme recognition. Walking signified restraint. These distinctions were not decorative. They were signals to Rome's elite. He is rising. He is manageable. He is dangerous. He is contained. The triumph functioned like a barometer of political weather. And as storms gathered in the late Republic, that barometer began swinging wildly. Consider again Julius Caesar. His multiple triumphs were not simply military acknowledgments. They were statements. The scale alone shifted perception. Days of celebration. Exotic animals. Lavish games. Massive distributions of wealth. Each addition increased his aura. Even his mercy toward certain defeated enemies was staged as spectacle. Mercy itself became performance. And performance shapes memory. When citizens retold the story of Caesar's triumph, they did not speak in statistics. They spoke in impressions. Gold piled high. Foreign kings humiliated. The city transformed. Emotion is more enduring than data. And the triumph mastered emotion. But here is a deeper layer. The triumph also disciplined Rome's imagination. By presenting conquered peoples as paraded trophies, it reduced distant cultures into symbols of submission. It simplified complex wars into digestible narratives. Good versus conquered. Rome versus the world. Such simplification strengthens unity. Yet it also erases nuance. And nuance, when erased repeatedly, reshapes identity. Rome began seeing itself not merely as powerful, but as destined. Destiny is powerful fuel. It justifies expansion. It justifies intervention. It justifies dominance. The triumph helped construct that mindset. Even architecture reinforced it. When arches were erected, like the later Arch of Titus, they froze movement into permanence. Stone reliefs carved processions eternally mid-step. Victory became timeless. Not a single event. But an identity. An identity sustains empires longer than armies alone. Now pause. Imagine you are a young Roman boy watching your first triumph. You see soldiers laughing. You see captives weeping. You see wealth unimaginable. You hear your father say, "This is what Rome does." That child grows up believing conquest is natural, necessary, even righteous. The triumph educates future citizens long before they vote or fight. It is generational conditioning. This is why it was a warning. Not because it shouted threats, but because it quietly shaped belief. Belief in superiority. Belief in inevitability. Belief that resistance is foolish. And beliefs, once internalized, guide actions without constant enforcement. That is efficient governance. Yet inside that efficiency lay tension. Because while the triumph elevated Rome collectively, it elevated individuals visibly. And individuals are unpredictable. The Republic attempted to regulate unpredictability through term limits, shared offices, and ritual humility. But ritual humility is fragile when public adoration grows too intense. Under Augustus, this tension found new equilibrium. He maintained republican language. He avoided overt kingship. But he absorbed military glory into imperial identity. The triumph became less about competition and more about consolidation. Other generals might earn honors. But ultimate victory belonged to the emperor. Even when absent from battle, imperial imagery credited him. The ritual survived. Its meaning narrowed. That narrowing stabilized Rome for a time. But even emperors could not fully control military prestige. Later centuries would see generals proclaimed emperor by their troops. Military loyalty remained powerful currency. The triumph had taught Rome for generations that military success equals legitimacy. That lesson could not be unlearned. And so the warning continued, though now directed inward. A strong general might save the empire. Or fracture it. The line between savior and usurper was thin. And Rome knew it. That knowledge explains something else. The insistence that during the triumph, a slave whispered, "Remember you are mortal." Whether fully historical or partially symbolic, the phrase endured because it expressed Rome's deepest fear. Hubris. Excess. The blurring of citizen and monarch. Mortality equalizes. It reminds the victor that time eventually dissolves all power. In a society obsessed with honor, that reminder was necessary. Because triumph without mortality becomes coronation. And Rome, at least in its republican imagination, resisted coronations fiercely. Even after emperors ruled, the memory of anti-monarchical identity lingered in language and ritual. Rome preferred illusion of continuity over abrupt transformation. The triumph helped maintain that illusion. Now let us widen the lens. Why does this ritual still fascinate us? Because it reveals something universal. States need spectacle. Not constant spectacle. But periodic, decisive displays. Victory parades. National holidays. Ceremonial honors. These moments reinforce collective identity. They transform abstract governance into visible narrative. The Roman triumph is one of the earliest, most sophisticated examples of this political theater. It balanced fear and pride. Glory and limitation. Individual ambition and institutional authority. For centuries, it succeeded. And when it failed, it did so not because it was meaningless, but because it had become too meaningful. Too powerful. Too effective at elevating the very individuals it sought to contain. That is the irony. The triumph strengthened Rome. And in strengthening Rome's generals, it helped weaken the Republic. Strength misdirected becomes vulnerability. And vulnerability disguised as spectacle can be hard to detect. So as we continue this long, unhurried exploration, imagine once more the final moments of a triumphal day. The sun setting behind the Capitoline Hill. The crowds thinning. The general removing his laurel wreath. The city returning to routine. On the surface, everything appears stable. But in the minds of soldiers, senators, rivals, and citizens, something has shifted. Perceptions have changed. And in politics, perception is power. The Roman triumph was not just celebration. It was calibration. A careful adjustment of reputation, authority, fear, and loyalty. And calibration, repeated over centuries, shaped the fate of one of history's most influential civilizations. We are not finished yet. Because beyond politics lies psychology. And beyond psychology lies memory. And both deserve our slow attention next. Now we move into the quietest layer of all. Psychology. Because the Roman triumph did not only manage armies or impress foreign envoys, it managed emotion. And emotion, when organized carefully, becomes one of the strongest foundations of power. Picture the atmosphere again in Rome. The streets are crowded long before dawn. People claim vantage points hours in advance. Anticipation builds slowly. Anticipation is important. Anticipation heightens impact. By the time the first trumpets sound, the crowd is ready to feel something. And Rome gives them exactly what they expect, but in carefully measured sequence. First comes suspense. Then spectacle. Then awe. Then relief. Then pride. The emotional arc mirrors storytelling structure. Beginning. Rising tension. Climax. Resolution. The triumph is narrative in motion. Why does that matter? Because human beings remember stories more vividly than policies. The Senate may pass decrees. Magistrates may enforce laws. But a triumph lives in memory. People recount where they stood. What they saw. How loud the cheers were. Memory binds communities. And when a state can attach itself to positive collective memory, loyalty strengthens without coercion. This is psychological governance. But the triumph also cultivates contrast. Citizens see abundance beside captivity. Freedom beside chains. Security beside humiliation. Contrast sharpens identity. We are the ones cheering. They are the ones bound. This binary simplifies the world. Simplification reduces doubt. Doubt weakens unity. Rome understood this instinctively, even if not in modern psychological terms. The ritual did not explain complex foreign policy. It dramatized dominance. And drama persuades faster than argument. Now consider the prisoners once more. When defeated leaders walked the route, they were not hidden. They were displayed with their regalia stripped away. Former kings reduced to spectacle. For the Roman crowd, this was reassurance. If even foreign royalty could be humbled, then Rome must be unassailable. Yet for ambitious Romans watching, another message flickered beneath the surface. Power can fall. Fortune shifts. Even rulers kneel. The triumph did not only reassure. It warned internally. Political rivals observed carefully. Today he rides. Tomorrow he might walk. This dual messaging is what made the ritual so effective. It comforted and cautioned at the same time. Now let us slow further. After the sacrifices at the Temple of Jupiter, the formal ceremony ended. But private celebrations continued. Banquets. Distribution of coins. Public games funded by the victorious general. Generosity reinforced affection. Affection reinforced reputation. Reputation reinforced political viability. This is where the triumph blends seamlessly into electoral strategy. In the Roman Republic, high office required public support. Military success alone was insufficient. It needed visibility. The triumph provided a stage larger than any speech in the forum. The forum influenced thousands. A triumph influenced the entire city. And cities talk. Stories travel to rural districts. Allies hear reports. Clients spread praise. The general's name becomes synonymous with success. In a competitive aristocratic society, name recognition is invaluable. So when we say the triumph was a warning, we must clarify. It warned enemies of Rome's power. It warned generals of mortality. It warned senators of rising rivals. And it warned the Republic itself of how easily admiration can tilt into dependency. The Roman political system relied on balance between elite families. Prestige was currency. Too much concentrated in one man destabilized equilibrium. The triumph, by magnifying prestige publicly, tested that balance every time it occurred. For centuries, the system absorbed the strain. But strain accumulates invisibly. As Rome expanded, campaigns became longer and wealth greater. A single victory in the East could dwarf earlier wars in Italy. The scale changed the stakes. And scale changes psychology. When spoils filled entire city squares, when gold flowed in quantities unimaginable before, expectations rose. The public grew accustomed to spectacle. And once expectation rises, ordinary governance feels dull. This is a subtle but powerful shift. A state that repeatedly relies on dramatic displays must maintain momentum. Otherwise enthusiasm wanes. Under emperors like Augustus, triumphal imagery became institutional rather than episodic. Monuments replaced processions. Architecture replaced rivalry. The emperor embodied continuous victory. This reduced internal competition. But it also centralized symbolic power. Where once many generals could aspire to triumph, now triumph became imperial property. Stability improved. Opportunity narrowed. Over time, that narrowing altered ambition itself. Generals seeking glory no longer competed within republican boundaries. They competed for imperial favor, or against imperial authority. The psychological landscape shifted. Yet the echo of the triumph persisted in language. To achieve, triumph, became synonymous with success. To celebrate, triumphantly, suggested undeniable dominance. The word outlived the ritual. That endurance reveals its depth. Few ceremonies survive as vocabulary. This one did. Why? Because it captured something fundamental about power and recognition. Human beings crave acknowledgement. Societies crave validation. The triumph provided both simultaneously. It validated Rome's expansion. It acknowledged the general's skill. It satisfied the crowd's hunger for spectacle. And it reinforced hierarchy. But all rituals carry risk. When admiration becomes personal rather than institutional, allegiance shifts. In the late Republic, that shift proved irreversible. When soldiers chanted Caesar's name louder than the Republic's, the balance had tipped. The triumph did not cause that alone. But it amplified visibility. It made personal power visible at scale. And visibility alters loyalty. Now let us imagine the silence after all of this. Years later. The same street. No procession. No trumpets. Just daily life. Shops open. Children play. Citizens argue in the forum. The absence of triumph is as instructive as its presence. Because a state cannot exist in perpetual spectacle. It must function quietly most of the time. The triumph was periodic punctuation. An exclamation mark. But governance is mostly written in plain text. The danger arises when exclamation marks become too frequent. Or when one man begins to own them exclusively. The Roman triumph, therefore, teaches restraint. It teaches the delicate art of celebrating success without destabilizing balance. It teaches that power must be acknowledged, but carefully framed. And it teaches that even the most elaborate celebration may conceal anxiety beneath applause. As we continue this long unfolding reflection, we approach something even deeper than psychology. Memory. Because long after the Republic fell, long after emperors ruled and fell in turn, the image of the triumph remained carved into stone and imagination. Arches stand. Reliefs endure. Stories survive. Even in decline, Rome remembered its triumphs. And memory can be more powerful than present reality. An empire fading can still appear eternal if its symbols persist. That persistence shaped medieval and modern political imagination alike. Rulers across centuries borrowed Roman imagery consciously. Laurel wreaths. Processional routes. Monumental arches. Military parades. The choreography felt timeless. Because Rome had perfected it early. And perhaps that is the final quiet truth for this segment of our journey. The Roman triumph was not merely a moment in history. It was a template. A blueprint for how states dramatize dominance. How they reward loyalty. How they manage ambition. How they transform violence into narrative. And like all blueprints, it could build stability. Or mask fracture. Which direction it moved depended not on the parade itself, but on the balance of power behind it. And balance, as Rome learned slowly, is fragile. We will continue walking. Because even after psychology and memory, there remains one more dimension to explore. Legacy. And how a warning from ancient streets still echoes in modern displays of power. Now we arrive at legacy. Not the loud legacy of monuments alone. But the quieter legacy of imitation. Because the Roman triumph did not disappear when the legions faded. It evolved. It traveled. It embedded itself in political imagination far beyond Rome. The physical ritual may have belonged to the Republic and early empire. But the idea, the structured display of victory as a message, became timeless. When later rulers marched through their capitals after war, they were not consciously recreating every Roman detail. But they were drawing from the same logic. Victory must be seen. Power must be staged. The public must participate in acknowledgement. And rivals must observe carefully. That logic began in its most refined form with the Roman triumph. Think about how deeply that blueprint shaped imperial identity under Augustus. Augustus understood something subtle. Endless personal triumphs would destabilize the system he was building. So he absorbed triumph into architecture. He constructed forums filled with statues of past heroes. He built monuments that celebrated victories as collective destiny rather than individual competition. Instead of multiple rising stars, he created a single fixed sun, the emperor. This was a strategic adjustment. The triumph no longer balanced ambition among elites. It centralized it. And by centralizing symbolic glory, Augustus stabilized Rome for generations. But stability came at a cost. Competition diminished. The Republic's dynamic tension, its rivalry-driven energy, faded. In its place emerged hierarchy. And hierarchy depends on continuity. If the emperor is strong, the system holds. If the emperor is weak, instability follows. The triumph, once a tool of containment, had become a pillar of imperial ideology. That shift is profound. Under the Republic, the triumph asked. Can we celebrate without empowering too much? Under the Empire, it declared. Power flows from one source. Same ritual. Different philosophy. And here lies the broader lesson. Political ceremonies are mirrors. They reflect the structure beneath them. Change the structure, and the reflection changes, even if the mirror looks identical. Now widen the lens even further. Across centuries, rulers borrowed Roman visual language. Laurel wreaths became symbols of victory. Arches became commemorative structures. Grand processions marked military success. Even modern military parades echo this ancient choreography. Columns of disciplined soldiers. Display of captured equipment. Leadership observing from elevated platforms. Crowds watching in organized anticipation. the emotional arc remains similar. Pride. Security. Dominance. Unity. The Roman triumph perfected this sequence. And once perfected, it proved adaptable. But every adaptation carries the same dual message. Celebration on the surface. Warning underneath. To enemies, observe our strength. To citizens, trust in our supremacy. To rivals, know your limits. The Roman triumph teaches that spectacle is rarely neutral. It always communicates beyond its visible purpose. Even silence during a procession communicates. Even scale communicates. When processions grow larger over time, the state is signaling expansion. When they shrink, observers notice. When they disappear entirely, that absence can be just as meaningful. In Rome's later centuries, triumphs became less frequent. Military crises multiplied. The empire shifted toward defense rather than conquest. Symbolic confidence waned. The ritual, once vibrant, became ceremonial formality. And when formality replaces energy, the meaning begins to hollow. That hollowing reveals something important. Spectacle requires substance. Without genuine victories, triumph becomes performance without foundation. And performance without foundation erodes trust. The Roman triumph endured because for centuries it rested on real expansion. When expansion slowed, the ritual's psychological force weakened. Now imagine the final triumph ever celebrated in ancient Rome. Crowds still gather. Trumpets still sound. But the empire is no longer expanding endlessly. Borders are pressured. Resources strained. The ritual continues, but its tone has shifted subtly. Not explosive confidence. Measured reassurance. The message becomes, we are still strong. Even if reality is more complicated. And here we uncover the final layer of warning. The triumph not only warned enemies and generals. It warned Rome about itself. It required self-awareness. It required discipline. It required understanding that celebration can inflate ego beyond sustainability. For centuries, Rome balanced on that awareness. When balance faltered, ritual alone could not save the system. That is perhaps the deepest truth. Ceremony cannot replace structural health. It can reinforce it. It can stabilize it. It can magnify it. But it cannot manufacture it indefinitely. The Roman triumph is therefore both masterpiece and cautionary tale. A masterpiece of political engineering. A cautionary tale about the limits of spectacle. And now, as we bring this long meditation toward its quiet close, let us step back entirely. What began as a parade becomes something far larger. It becomes a lens. Through that lens we see how republics manage ambition. How empires project dominance. How crowds internalize identity. How rituals encode ideology. And how warnings can hide within applause. The Roman triumph was not built merely for celebration. It was constructed as a system. A carefully calibrated machine for transforming military success into civic narrative. For centuries, it worked. When it failed, it revealed not weakness of ritual, but fragility of balance. And balance, in any political system, is temporary. And performance without foundation erodes trust. The Roman triumph endured because for centuries it rested on real expansion. When expansion slowed, the ritual's psychological force weakened. Now imagine the final triumph ever celebrated in ancient Rome. Crowds still gather. Trumpets still sound. But the empire is no longer expanding endlessly. Borders are pressured. Resources strained. The ritual continues, but its tone has shifted subtly. Not explosive confidence. Measured reassurance. The message becomes, we are still strong. Even if reality is more complicated. And here we uncover the final layer of warning. The triumph not only warned enemies and generals. It warned Rome about itself. It required self-awareness. It required discipline. It required understanding that celebration can inflate ego beyond sustainability. For centuries, Rome balanced on that awareness. When balance faltered, ritual alone could not save the system. That is perhaps the deepest truth. Ceremony cannot replace structural health. It can reinforce it. It can stabilize it. It can magnify it. But it cannot manufacture it indefinitely. The Roman triumph is therefore both masterpiece and cautionary tale. A masterpiece of political engineering. A cautionary tale about the limits of spectacle. And now, as we bring this long meditation toward its quiet close, let us step back entirely. What began as a parade becomes something far larger. It becomes a lens. Through that lens we see how republics manage ambition. How empires project dominance. How crowds internalize identity. How rituals encode ideology. And how warnings can hide within applause. The Roman triumph was not built merely for celebration. It was constructed as a system. A carefully calibrated machine for transforming military success into civic narrative. For centuries, it worked. When it failed, it revealed not weakness of ritual, but fragility of balance. And balance, in any political system, is temporary. So if you remember one image from this long journey, let it be this. A general in a chariot. Face painted red like Jupiter. Crowds roaring. Prisoners in chains. A slave whispering behind him. Remember you are mortal. That whisper echoes across centuries. Not just to Roman generals. But to every state that celebrates power publicly. Celebrate carefully. Magnify wisely. Because every triumph carries within it the seeds of transformation. And sometimes, of unintended consequence. The parade ends. The dust settles. But the warning remains. Because after legacy comes something even quieter. Decline. Not dramatic collapse. Not burning cities. But gradual transformation. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the world that had created the Roman triumph no longer existed in the same form. The Republic was long gone. The early empire's confident expansion had slowed. Borders hardened. Armies defended more than they conquered. And when conquest slows, triumph changes. The old Republican triumph, competitive, political, negotiated, had already faded. Under emperors, it had become imperial property. But as military pressures increased and leadership became more unstable, even imperial triumph lost its old clarity. Emperors still celebrated victories. But they did so cautiously. Sometimes they remained physically distant from Rome, ruling from frontier cities. Sometimes the capital itself shifted in importance. When Constantine the Great founded Constantinople, the center of imperial gravity moved eastward. And with that shift, so too did the stage. Triumphal imagery did not disappear. It transformed. Christian symbolism blended with imperial victory. Instead of sacrifices to Jupiter, rulers credited divine favor in new theological language. Instead of republican memory, there was imperial destiny. But the choreography of victory, procession, architecture, visual dominance, remained recognizable. The Roman triumph had become embedded in the DNA of rulership. Yet something subtle was gone. Under the Republic, triumphs were moments of tension. Under the early empire, they were declarations of supremacy. Under the later empire, they were affirmations of survival. That tonal shift matters. When victory celebrations emphasize endurance rather than expansion, they reveal underlying strain. The ritual still functions. But it functions defensively. The warning changes again. Now the message is not, resist and be crushed. It is, we still stand. And that difference tells us much about Rome's changing self-perception. As centuries passed and the Western Empire fragmented, triumph in its classical form faded entirely. But the vocabulary endured. Medieval rulers crowned themselves with laurel imagery. Renaissance artists revived Roman symbolism consciously. Even modern political language uses the word triumph without remembering its full weight. That endurance proves something remarkable. The Roman triumph succeeded not merely as ceremony, but as concept. It defined what public victory should look like. Structured. Visible. Collective. Sanctioned. And always layered with meaning beyond celebration. Now let us draw everything together slowly. The Roman triumph was a military procession, a political negotiation, a psychological performance, a social lesson, an architectural blueprint, a warning disguised as applause. It balanced individual glory against institutional authority. For centuries, it maintained that balance through ritual humility and Senate oversight. When that balance collapsed in the late Republic, when generals like Julius Caesar accumulated loyalty too powerful to contain, the triumph no longer stabilized the system. It magnified imbalance. Under Augustus, it was reshaped into imperial propaganda, centralizing glory to prevent rivalry. Under later emperors, it affirmed continuity in a changing world. And when Rome itself declined in the West, the triumph survived only as memory and imitation. This arc, rise, adaptation, transformation, mirrors Rome's own story. Which is fitting. Because the triumph was never separate from Rome's political identity. It was Rome in miniature. Ambitious. Disciplined. Spectacular. Anxious. Controlled, until it wasn't. Now, imagine one final scene. Not a grand procession. Not cheering crowds. But an empty arch standing against the sky. The reliefs carved into stone still show captives and soldiers frozen mid-step. The chariot remains etched in marble. But no one moves. No one cheers. The ritual has ended. What remains is memory. And memory, carved into stone, outlasts noise. That is perhaps the ultimate irony. The triumph was designed to amplify sound, trumpets, chants, applause. Yet what survives are silent monuments. And those silent monuments whisper the same message the slave once whispered to the general. Remember. Power is temporary. Glory is staged. Balance is fragile. The Roman triumph was never only about celebration. It was about management, of ambition, of fear, of identity. It warned enemies. It warned rivals. It warned Rome itself. And across centuries, it still warns us. Celebrate carefully. Because spectacle can strengthen a system. But if misjudged, it can also reveal its limits. The procession has ended. The dust has settled. The chariot stands still. And the warning remains. Then let us continue, not forward in time, but inward. Because there is still one more layer beneath ceremony, psychology, and legacy. Control of time. The Roman triumph did something extraordinary, it paused ordinary life. For one day, sometimes several, routine stopped in Rome. Markets slowed. Legal business halted. Political disputes softened. Attention focused in one direction. When a state can command collective time, it demonstrates authority at the deepest level. Armies control territory. Laws control behavior. But rituals control attention. And attention is power. The triumph declared. Today, you will watch. You will witness victory. You will absorb meaning. This temporary suspension of normal rhythm heightened the event's impact. Ordinary days blend together. Ceremonial days imprint themselves onto memory. And Rome was a civilization obsessed with memory. Ancestral masks displayed in aristocratic homes. Names carved into stone. Deeds recited in funerals. Reputation extended beyond death. The triumph fit seamlessly into that culture. It guaranteed that a general's name would not fade quietly. But Rome added one crucial constraint: the triumph was temporary. After the ritual ended, the general stepped down from his elevated identity. He returned to ordinary clothing. Ordinary political rivalry. Ordinary vulnerability. This return to normalcy was not accidental. It prevented the extraordinary from becoming permanent. And permanence is what the Republic feared most. A permanent extraordinary figure becomes a monarch. So the triumph's design always included descent. Ascend the Capitoline Hill. Offer sacrifice. Descend again into civilian life. Upward movement. Downward correction. That rhythm mirrored Republican ideology. No office forever. No authority without term. No glory without expiration. And yet, as we have seen, repetition strains even the best design. As Rome's wars expanded across continents, some generals did not simply return to civilian life psychologically. They had commanded legions for years. Negotiated with kings. Reshaped provinces. Civilian politics must have felt small in comparison. When such men re-entered the forum, the temptation to transcend limits grew. The triumph had elevated them physically above the crowd. Returning to equality required discipline. Not all possessed it. The Republic depended on self-restraint among elites. Ritual could encourage restraint. It could not guarantee it. And so we arrive at the essential tension beneath everything. The Roman triumph was a tool for managing ambition. But ambition is resilient. It adapts. It expands with opportunity. It resists confinement. In many ways, the triumph worked because early Rome's scale was manageable. Victories were significant, but not world-altering. As the empire grew vast, victories became transformative. And transformative power resists ritual containment. When Julius Caesar celebrated multiple triumphs in succession, the ritual no longer felt like temporary elevation. It felt like inevitability. When he was declared dictator for life, the descent never came. The upward motion froze. The correction failed. The Republic, structured around cycles, could not survive permanent ascent. After Caesar's assassination, Rome faced a choice. Return to cyclical balance. Or accept concentration. Under Augustus, concentration won, but disguised itself as continuity. Augustus did not abolish triumph. He absorbed it. He reshaped it into imperial architecture and state narrative. He ensured that ascent always pointed toward one center. This resolved competition. It did not eliminate the underlying human desire for recognition. Later emperors would still struggle with ambitious generals. But now the system acknowledged that supremacy existed. The illusion of equal rivalry ended. The triumph's transformation mirrored that political evolution. And here lies perhaps the deepest lesson of all. Ceremonies reveal what a society fears most. The Republic feared kings. So it built a ritual that elevated men temporarily while whispering mortality. The empire feared fragmentation. So it built a narrative of singular, eternal authority. Both used triumphal imagery. But each expressed a different anxiety. Fear of domination. Fear of collapse. The Roman triumph was therefore a barometer of Rome's deepest insecurities. Not its confidence. Its insecurity. Confidence needs no elaborate staging. Insecurity does. This is why triumph was so choreographed. So precise. So symbolic. It was reassurance made visible. Reassurance that victory belonged to Rome. Reassurance that generals were mortal. Reassurance that order prevailed. As long as reassurance matched reality, the system held. When reality diverged, reassurance became fragile. And fragile reassurance cannot sustain an empire forever. Now, let us step completely outside Rome. Strip away marble. Strip away Latin. Strip away laurel wreaths. What remains is something universal. Societies celebrate victories publicly. They parade strength. They narrate dominance. They create rituals to convert violence into legitimacy. Rome refined this into art. But the impulse is human. Victory alone is not enough. It must be seen. Acknowledged. Structured. Integrated into identity. Without ritual, victory is temporary. With ritual, it becomes memory. The Roman triumph ensured that no conquest vanished into abstraction. Each one marched physically through the heart of the city. Each one etched itself into collective consciousness. Each one reminded citizens who they were. And perhaps that is why we still speak of triumph today. Not as parade. Not as chariot. But as culmination. Achievement. Public recognition. The word survived because the structure behind it was powerful. But the warning survived too. Hidden in that ancient whisper. Remember, you are mortal. That whisper is political wisdom. It reminds leaders that acclaim fades. It reminds states that power fluctuates. It reminds societies that spectacle cannot substitute for stability. And it reminds us, centuries later, that behind every celebration of dominance lies a negotiation with vulnerability. The Roman triumph was not merely celebration. It was controlled elevation. It was theater with tension. It was applause balanced against anxiety. And in that delicate balance, Rome revealed both its brilliance and its fragility. The procession is long over. The chariot's gone. The trumpet's silent. But the structure, the idea, still walks beside us. Quietly. Patiently. A reminder carved into history. Power that must be displayed is power that must also be managed. And management, in the end, determines survival. Now the streets are empty. The arches remain. And the warning, soft, persistent, continues to echo through time. Then let us continue, but now into the quiet aftermath that no procession ever shows. Because every triumph ended the same way. Night fell over Rome. Torches dimmed. Crowds dispersed. The trumpets stopped. And Rome returned to itself. That return is the most revealing moment of all. During the procession, everything is heightened, color, sound, symbolism. But once it ends, the city must absorb what it has just witnessed. And absorption is political. In the days after a triumph, conversations ripple through the forum. Merchants discuss new trade possibilities from conquered territories. Politicians debate alliances. Rival generals calculate their own chances at glory. Ordinary citizens recount the spectacle to neighbors who could not attend. The triumph does not end when the chariot stops. It continues in narrative. And narrative shapes reputation. Reputation, in Rome, was not decoration. It was currency. A general's prestige determined marriage alliances, electoral success, influence in Senate debates, and loyalty among clients. The triumph injected enormous prestige into one name at a time. Which meant the rest of the elite had to respond. Some aligned. Some resisted. Some quietly prepared their own campaigns to balance the scale. This is how the triumph became a competitive engine. It fueled ambition by proving what was possible. If one man could ride through the city crowned in laurel, another could aspire to do the same. Competition energized the republic. But it also destabilized it. The more triumphs occurred, the more glory became normalized. And normalization reduces awe. To maintain impact, spectacles must grow larger. More prisoners. More gold. More exotic displays. Scale expands. Expectation rises. Soon, modest victories feel insufficient. This escalation mirrors something universal about power. Success redefines baseline. Rome did not begin as a global empire. It became one gradually. Each triumph reinforced the idea that expansion was natural. That dominance was destiny. But destiny narratives are dangerous. Because when expansion slows, identity feels threatened. What happens when a state built on visible victory encounters limits? The triumph cannot answer that. It can only amplify what exists. If victories are genuine and sustainable, triumph stabilizes confidence. If victories mask deeper strain, triumph postpones reckoning. This is why the Roman triumph must be understood not as celebration alone, but as amplification. It amplified strength. It amplified rivalry. It amplified insecurity. And eventually, it amplified imbalance. Consider again the late Republic. When Julius Caesar celebrated multiple triumphs in succession, Rome did not merely witness victory. It witnessed concentration. Concentration of wealth. Concentration of loyalty. Concentration of narrative. He controlled the story of Rome's greatness. And whoever controls the story controls legitimacy. That frightened the Senate more than any battlefield loss. Because military defeat can be recovered. Narrative dominance is harder to dismantle. After Caesar's assassination, Rome tried to restore balance. But the cycle had shifted too far. Under Augustus, the solution was not to abolish triumph, but to redefine it. No more open rivalry. No more unpredictable magnification. Victory became imperial property. Glory flowed upward. This stabilized politics for a time. But it also changed citizenship. Under the Republic, citizens participated emotionally in competition among elites. Under the Empire, citizens participated in admiration of a single center. The triumph reflected that transition. From shared ambition to centralized authority. And yet, even centralized authority required performance. Even emperors needed visible demonstrations of strength. Triumphal arches rose in stone. Coins bore images of victory. Art depicted conquered peoples kneeling. The ritual became permanent architecture. Instead of one day of spectacle, the city itself became a stage of frozen triumph. That permanence solved one problem. It eliminated competition. But it introduced another. When glory is constant, it risks becoming background. And background rarely inspires vigilance. Over centuries, as crises multiplied and emperors changed rapidly, triumphal imagery continued, but its psychological force weakened. When victory becomes rare, its display feels fragile. When leadership changes frequently, permanence becomes illusion. The later empire relied more on reassurance than dominance. And reassurance without confidence feels different. By then, the triumph was no longer a balancing act. It was memory. A reminder of what Rome once was. And that is the final transformation. The triumph began as containment of ambition. It evolved into projection of supremacy. It ended as preservation of identity. Each phase reveals a different Rome. A competitive republic. A centralized empire. A civilization clinging to legacy. Yet across all phases, one thread remains constant. The need to stage power publicly. Because power unseen invites doubt. And doubt erodes authority. The Roman triumph understood that instinct early. It choreographed domination so thoroughly that even centuries later, the model feels familiar. Military parades. Victory speeches. Monuments. Public honors. All descend, in some distant way, from that ancient chariot rolling along the Via Sacra. But perhaps the most enduring element is not the chariot. Not the arch. Not the laurel. It is the whisper. Remember you are mortal. That whisper is not weakness. It is wisdom. It acknowledges that power is temporary. That applause fades. That institutions outlive individuals, unless individuals consume them. Rome flourished longest when it remembered that balance. It faltered when elevation ceased to descend. And so, as we conclude this long and careful meditation, we return to where we began. The Roman triumph was not built for celebration. Celebration was its surface. Warning was its structure. It warned enemies of Rome's strength. It warned generals of their limits. It warned citizens of the cost of imbalance. And in its final echo, it warns us. Because every society that stages power must decide. Is this spectacle strengthening balance? Or masking fragility? Rome's answer changed over time. And in that change, we see both the brilliance and vulnerability of one of history's greatest civilizations. The procession has ended. The arches remain. The lessons endure. And the warning, quiet, patient, ancient, still walks beside every display of triumph we witness today. Then let us continue one final stretch, not to add noise, but to reach stillness. Because after spectacle, psychology, rivalry, empire, and decline, what remains is reflection. Imagine standing alone beneath a triumphal arch long after Rome's power has faded. No soldiers. No senators. No chained kings. Only wind moving through stone corridors. The reliefs still show marching figures. The chariot still rolls in carved marble. The laurel wreath still crowns a frozen general. But history has moved on. And this contrast is revealing. The triumph was designed to prove permanence. Yet permanence belonged only to the stone, not the power. That is the ultimate paradox. Rome mastered the art of staging dominance. But no ritual can make dominance eternal. The Roman triumph teaches us that political systems are sustained not by force alone, but by narrative control. Victory must be interpreted. Power must be displayed. Authority must be framed. Without framing, conquest is chaos. With framing, it becomes destiny. And Rome excelled at framing. When a general rode through Rome painted like Jupiter, the message was not subtle. Rome's victories were divine. Rome's expansion was justified. Rome's authority was inevitable. That inevitability is what the triumph performed. Not merely strength. Inevitability. But inevitability is the most fragile illusion of all. Because it depends on continuity. The moment continuity breaks, inevitability dissolves. When the Republic fractured under men like Julius Caesar, the triumph could not preserve balance. When imperial stability faltered centuries later, triumphal imagery could not restore confidence. Ritual reinforces reality. It cannot replace it. And that may be the deepest warning embedded within the ceremony. For centuries, Rome balanced on a delicate equation. Military success plus political restraint equals stability. The triumph amplified the first and encouraged the second. When restraint weakened, amplification became distortion. And distortion accelerates collapse. This lesson extends beyond Rome. Every society that celebrates victory publicly walks the same line. How much elevation is too much? How long can applause last without altering hierarchy? At what point does admiration turn into dependence? The Roman triumph answers none of these questions directly. But it demonstrates the consequences of miscalculation. Now let us return once more to the image of the slave behind the general. Remember, you are mortal. This phrase endures because it captures Rome's self-awareness. They knew ambition was dangerous. They knew popularity could destabilize order. They knew glory intoxicates. And so they built humility into spectacle. That is sophisticated political engineering. Few societies embed caution so visibly into celebration. Yet embedding caution does not guarantee compliance. The Republic trusted its elites to internalize the warning. Some did. Some did not. History often turns on which individuals listen to whispers, and which ignore them. By the time Augustus reshaped Rome into empire, the whisper had shifted meaning. Mortality no longer reminded a general to step down. It reminded an emperor to secure succession. The focus moved from limiting power to preserving it. Same words. Different context. This evolution shows how rituals adapt to new political realities. But adaptation always changes emphasis. The triumph, once a balancing tool, became a legitimizing instrument. Later still, it became memory. And memory, though powerful, cannot command legions. As we stand at the true end of this long journey, one image remains stronger than all others. A procession that appears triumphant on the surface, yet is constructed from tension underneath. That tension is what made Rome resilient. And eventually, what made it vulnerable. Because tension requires constant adjustment. The triumph adjusted ambition for centuries. When adjustment failed, structure faltered. So what was the Roman triumph? Not just a parade. Not just a celebration. Not just propaganda. It was a negotiation between glory and restraint. Between ambition and order. Between human ego and institutional survival. And that negotiation defines every political system, ancient or modern. The Roman triumph is remembered because it dramatized that negotiation publicly. It turned abstract power into visible theater. It made hierarchy tangible. It made warning ceremonial. And in doing so, it left behind more than monuments. It left behind a lesson. Celebrate power. But measure it. Honor achievement. But contain it. Stage dominance. But never forget mortality. The chariot has stopped. The laurel has withered. The empire has fallen. Yet the warning still stands, carved in stone, whispered through centuries. Triumph is never just celebration. It is a test of balance. And balance, more than victory, determines how long a civilization endures. If we are to continue, then we move not forward in time, but deeper into meaning. Because long after the last official triumph rolled through Rome, the idea of triumph refused to disappear. It changed shape. It changed language. But it survived. When medieval kings processed through cathedral cities beneath banners and incense, the structure echoed Rome. When Renaissance rulers staged elaborate entries into Florence or Paris, choreographed with symbolism and allegory, the logic was familiar. Victory must be seen. Authority must be staged. Power must be narrated. Even when the empire itself was gone, the architecture of spectacle remained. That is Rome's quiet inheritance to the world. Not roads. Not aqueducts. Not law. But political theater. And political theater may be the most enduring Roman invention of all. Because it works. Humans respond to ceremony. We respond to procession. We respond to visual hierarchy. A figure elevated above the crowd. Music swelling. Crowds aligned. Symbols displayed. This is not accidental psychology. It is engineered perception. The Roman triumph understood something fundamental. People do not merely obey power. They need to witness it. The triumph made power visible in a controlled narrative. And narrative is stronger than raw force. Force compels the body. Narrative persuades the mind. When a general like Julius Caesar staged multiple triumphs in quick succession, he wasn't only celebrating conquest. He was rewriting public memory. Each parade layered achievement upon achievement until resistance felt futile. It created momentum. And momentum is dangerous in politics. Momentum convinces people that the future has already been decided. Once enough citizens believe that, opposition weakens. This is why triumphs were both admired and feared. Admired by the crowd. Feared by the Senate. Because spectacle compresses complexity. The messy realities of war, logistics, compromise, loss, disappear. What remains is gold, captives, and cheering. Complex war becomes simple victory. And simplicity is persuasive. Yet simplicity hides fragility. The triumph could only exist if Rome kept winning. What happens when victories slow? What happens when enemies adapt? What happens when borders stabilize and expansion ends? The ceremony depends on success. Without success, it has no fuel. By the later centuries of the empire, triumphs became rarer. Resources were strained. Threats multiplied. Defensive wars replaced grand conquests. It is difficult to celebrate holding ground with the same grandeur as conquering continents. And so the spectacle shrank. Or transformed. Emperors adopted new rituals. Christian processions replaced pagan symbolism. Religious imagery overtook martial display. The structure remained, but the meaning evolved. Instead of Jupiter's favor, it was divine providence. Instead of chained kings, it was relics and saints. The form endured because the psychological function endured. Authority still needed reinforcement. Legitimacy still needed visibility. But now it was framed spiritually. And this transition is crucial. It shows that ritual is adaptable. But its purpose remains constant. To make power feel rightful. Rightfulness is the core of stability. Force alone breeds fear. Rightfulness breeds acceptance. The Roman triumph was not about intimidation alone. It was about moral positioning. We have conquered because we deserve to. We rule because destiny favors us. We lead because we are chosen. These are powerful messages. They echo across civilizations. Even modern states, though less overt, stage variations of triumph. Military parades. State funerals. National celebrations. Public inaugurations. These events are not random traditions. They are continuity rituals. They reaffirm the structure. They remind citizens who leads, why they lead, and how that leadership fits into a larger story. The Roman triumph was simply the prototype. And prototypes matter. Because once invented, a pattern can be repeated indefinitely. But here is the most important continuation. No ritual can save a system that has lost internal coherence. When corruption spreads. When institutions weaken. When economic strain overwhelms confidence. Ceremony becomes hollow. The arch still stands. The music still plays. But the belief erodes. And belief is the invisible pillar. The Roman triumph thrived in a culture that believed in Rome's destiny. When that belief fractured, regionally, politically, spiritually, no parade could repair it. This is why studying the triumph is not just antiquarian curiosity. It is diagnostic. It teaches us to look beyond spectacle. To ask. What reality supports this display? Is strength being demonstrated, or compensated for? Is unity genuine, or performed? The triumph at its best reflected real cohesion. At its worst, it tried to mask division. And when masking becomes the primary function of ritual, decline accelerates. As we reach further into this continuation, we realize something subtle. The triumph was less about the general than about the crowd. Yes, the general stood elevated. Yes, he wore purple and gold. Yes, he rode in a chariot like a god. But the true audience was Rome itself. The citizens needed reassurance. They needed proof that sacrifice was worth it. That sons lost in war had not died for nothing. That taxes funded success. That expansion improved security. The triumph reassured. It converted loss into meaning. And meaning sustains societies longer than material gain. Yet meaning must align with reality. When wars became defensive disasters. When territory shrank. When internal conflict consumed resources. The triumph's promise lost credibility. And once credibility fades, ritual becomes nostalgia. Eventually, it becomes history. And finally, it becomes lesson. So what is the final continuation of this long exploration? It is this. Rome did not fall because it celebrated victory. It fell because celebration outpaced sustainability. Because expansion became expectation. Because spectacle amplified ambition beyond control. The triumph magnified Rome's strengths. It also magnified its vulnerabilities. And in that amplification lies its brilliance, and its warning. We end not with collapse, but with clarity. The Roman triumph reveals a civilization deeply aware of human nature. Aware of ego. Aware of envy. Aware of ambition. Aware of mortality. They built a ceremony that acknowledged all of it. A parade that praised glory while whispering caution. A spectacle that dazzled while restraining. For centuries, that balance held. And when balance fails, history turns. The chariot wheels have long since worn away. The arches remain. And in their shadows, the lesson still waits. Power must be performed. But it must also be limited. Glory must be celebrated. But it must also be humbled. Victory must be shown. But it must also be governed. That is the enduring continuation of Rome's triumph. Not the parade itself. But the tension it carried, between magnificence and mortality. And that tension, in every era, determines whether triumph becomes legacy. Or prelude to decline. Because if the Roman triumph teaches us anything, it is that power does not exist quietly. It seeks form. It seeks ritual. It seeks visibility. And when one civilization perfects a form, others adapt it. After the Western Empire faded, its eastern counterpart continued in altered fashion through Byzantine Empire. There, emperors staged elaborate court ceremonies inside Constantinople's palaces. The chariot gave way to the throne room. The dusty road gave way to polished marble. But the logic remained intact: elevation, symbolism, divine association. The emperor stood beneath mosaics of Christ. Purple remained the color of authority. Hierarchy was choreographed. Nothing was accidental. The spectacle was no longer about conquering Gaul or Africa. It was about continuity. Continuity is the ultimate triumph. Because conquest expands territory. Continuity preserves identity. Rome's greatest achievement was not expansion. It was longevity. And longevity depends on belief systems reinforced publicly. Even beyond Europe, variations appear. Imperial China staged formal court rituals where tribute missions bowed before the emperor. Islamic caliphates developed ceremonial entries and public acknowledgments of sovereignty. Medieval monarchs entered cities beneath canopies as bells rang and clergy processed. Different cultures. Different religions. Same structure. The ruler elevated. The crowd aligned. The narrative reinforced. The Roman triumph did not invent hierarchy. But it perfected the public dramatization of it. And dramatization is key. Because humans understand stories better than statistics. A parade of gold and captives communicates more quickly than a ledger of military expenditure. A chariot communicates authority faster than a policy speech. Visual hierarchy bypasses analysis. It goes straight to instinct. That is why spectacle is powerful. But spectacle without substance collapses. And here is where our continuation becomes philosophical. Every civilization must answer a silent question. Is our strength sustainable? The Roman triumph assumed yes. Each procession implied future victories. Each laurel wreath hinted at more to come. But expansion has limits. Economies strain. Borders stretch. Enemies adapt. Internal politics fragment. No empire conquers indefinitely. And when expansion stops, identity must shift. Rome struggled with that transition. From republic to empire. From conquest to consolidation. From pagan ritual to Christian symbolism. Each shift required reinterpretation of triumph. At first, triumph meant external victory. Later, it meant internal stability. Eventually, it meant spiritual legitimacy. But reinterpretation takes time. And time exposes fractures. By the later centuries, Roman citizens were less dazzled by spectacle. Economic pressures weighed heavier. Local loyalties replaced centralized pride. The empire became less a unified organism and more a collection of strained regions. And ritual cannot glue together what material conditions pull apart. This is not unique to Rome. It is structural. Ceremony strengthens cohesion when cohesion already exists. It cannot manufacture unity from emptiness. So perhaps the deepest continuation of our story is this. The triumph worked because Rome worked. When Rome faltered, the triumph faded naturally. Not by decree. Not by sudden prohibition. But by irrelevance. Relevance is the quiet judge of all rituals. And yet, even in irrelevance, memory persists. Today, tourists walk beneath arches once built to commemorate victories. They admire relief carvings. They photograph Latin inscriptions. Few remember the specific battles. Fewer recall the political calculations. But they recognize grandeur. That recognition is inheritance. Rome's language of power still speaks visually. It speaks in architecture. In ceremony. In national symbolism. In state pageantry. The triumph became archetype. And archetypes outlive institutions. So where does that leave us at the true end of this long unfolding? It leaves us with awareness. Awareness that power is never static. It must be shown. But showing it changes it. It must be celebrated. But celebration elevates individuals. It must be controlled. But control requires discipline. The Roman triumph encapsulated this balancing act in a single moving tableau. A general crowned like a god. A slave whispering mortality. A cheering crowd. A watchful senate. A city at the center of the known world. Glory and warning intertwined. That intertwining is Rome's intellectual legacy. Because it acknowledges something rare. Humans crave greatness. But greatness destabilizes equality. So systems must manage admiration carefully. Too little recognition breeds resentment. Too much breeds autocracy. The triumph walked that line. For centuries. Until it could not. And perhaps that is the final continuation. Civilizations do not fall because they celebrate success. They fall when celebration replaces strategy. When performance substitutes planning. When symbolism obscures reality. Rome's triumph was magnificent. But magnificence alone cannot sustain a world-spanning state. It must be matched by infrastructure, economy, governance, adaptability. When those falter, no chariot can compensate. And so we conclude not with collapse, but with understanding. The Roman triumph was a mirror. It reflected Rome at its height. It revealed Rome's psychology. It exposed Rome's ambitions. It even hinted at Rome's limits. And that is why it remains worthy of such long examination. Because within that single parade lies an entire civilization's struggle to balance glory with survival. The wheels have stopped turning. The incense has cleared. The crowd has dispersed. But the lesson remains. Power must be visible. Power must be measured. And above all, power must remember its own mortality. Then we continue, not to extend the parade, but to step back and look at the silence after it. Because the most revealing part of any triumph is not the cheering. It is the morning after. The banners are taken down. The laurel crowns dry and crack. The painted face is washed clean. The general returns to ordinary clothing. And the city returns to routine. That return is everything. It proves whether the spectacle strengthened the system, or merely distracted it. In the Roman Republic, the return to normalcy was intentional. A victorious commander, no matter how celebrated, was expected to step back into the rank of citizen. Offices were temporary. Authority was rotational. Power flowed, but it did not permanently settle. That rhythm created resilience. When figures like Julius Caesar disrupted that rhythm, Rome did not collapse instantly. Instead, it entered a long period of tension, civil wars, alliances, betrayals, recalibrations. The system strained because the balance between spectacle and structure had shifted. Under Augustus, the solution was subtle: preserve the appearance of republican forms while consolidating imperial control. Triumph continued, but its meaning changed. It no longer celebrated temporary military glory. It affirmed permanent authority. That transformation was quiet, but profound. The triumph stopped being a celebration within the system. It became a reinforcement of the system's new shape. And this reveals something critical about ritual. Ritual does not resist political change. It adapts to it. It can support a republic. It can support an empire. It can support a theocracy. The form survives because its function, legitimizing power, remains necessary. But as rituals adapt, they also reveal the priorities of their age. In the early republic, humility was embedded visibly. The whisper of mortality balanced glory. In the early empire, divinity was emphasized more strongly. Emperors associated themselves with gods not as metaphor, but as near reality. Later still, under Christian influence, triumph imagery shifted toward spiritual victory: sin conquered, heresy defeated, faith preserved. Each stage tells us what Rome feared most. Early Rome feared individual domination. Imperial Rome feared instability. Christian Rome feared spiritual fragmentation. And the triumph, in its changing form, responded to those fears. That is why it remains such a powerful case study. It is not just a parade. It is a diagnostic tool for political psychology. Now let us consider something even quieter. The Roman triumph required public participation. Crowds had to gather. Citizens had to cheer. The spectacle relied on shared attention. Without an audience, it would lose meaning. This reminds us that power is relational. It exists between ruler and ruled. If the crowd withdraws emotionally, spectacle weakens. If belief erodes, pageantry becomes hollow. In Rome's later centuries, loyalty fragmented geographically and culturally. The empire was vast. Identities diversified. Allegiances shifted toward local leaders, military commanders, or religious authorities. The central spectacle in Rome no longer resonated everywhere equally. And when resonance fades, cohesion fades. The triumph could not command distant provinces the way it once had. Distance dilutes theater. This too is a structural lesson. Power must be seen to be felt. When territories expand beyond shared experience, ritual loses intensity. Rome's early triumphs resonated because citizens felt directly invested in expansion. Later generations, taxed and distant from frontier wars, felt less connection. Connection sustains legitimacy. Without connection, authority becomes abstract. And abstraction weakens loyalty. So in the end, the Roman triumph offers layered insight. It shows how spectacle can unify. It shows how ritual can restrain ambition. It shows how ceremony can legitimize transformation. And it shows how even the most sophisticated performance cannot substitute for structural strength. That final truth echoes beyond antiquity. Any society that elevates leaders publicly must manage the tension between admiration and accountability. Any state that celebrates success must ensure success remains real. Any civilization that builds monuments must maintain the foundations beneath them. Rome managed this balance for centuries. That alone is extraordinary. Its triumphs were not empty excess. They were components of governance. Carefully regulated. Politically negotiated. Culturally embedded. They worked because Rome's institutions were strong. When institutions weakened, the triumph faded naturally. Not because ceremony lost beauty, but because beauty cannot hold up a crumbling structure. And perhaps that is the most enduring image to leave with. An arch still standing under open sky. Carved soldiers marching eternally in stone. A chariot forever in motion. But no crowd. No cheering. Only time passing quietly. The stone endures. The empire does not. And within that contrast lies the final continuation. Spectacle can immortalize memory. It cannot immortalize power. Power, like the general in the chariot, remains mortal. And the whisper behind it, the reminder of mortality, may be the wisest element Rome ever placed at the center of its grandest celebration. Then let us continue one final time, not by adding new events, but by asking the question that has been quietly waiting beneath all of this. Why are we still talking about the Roman triumph at all? Because thousands of parades have happened in human history. Thousands of victories have been celebrated. Thousands of rulers have been praised in public ceremony. Yet the Roman triumph endures in memory in a way most do not. It endures because it captured something universal about power. It revealed that authority is not only exercised, it is staged. And staging changes how authority is understood. When a victorious commander processed through Rome, dressed in purple, crowned in laurel, painted like a god, he was temporarily lifted above ordinary humanity. But not permanently. That temporary elevation is key. The Roman system understood that glory must have limits. Even when those limits were later tested, by figures such as Julius Caesar, the original design shows a deep awareness of human vulnerability to admiration. Admiration is intoxicating. Crowds amplify it. Symbols magnify it. Victory justifies it. And without constraint, it transforms republics into autocracies. Rome's triumph was brilliant because it acknowledged this danger openly. It institutionalized glory so that glory would not destabilize the state. That is sophisticated governance. But governance evolves. Under Augustus, the system did not abandon spectacle, it absorbed it. Instead of limiting elevation, it normalized it. The emperor was no longer temporarily godlike. He became permanently central. The balance shifted. And once balance shifts, structures slowly reconfigure around that shift. This is not a moral judgment. It is structural observation. Ritual reflects political architecture. When architecture changes, ritual changes. Yet something fascinating remains. Even after the Roman state fragmented in the West, even after imperial administration weakened, even after external pressures reshaped Europe, triumphal imagery survived. Arches still stood. Latin inscriptions remained visible. Future generations interpreted them through new lenses. Christian rulers saw divine providence. Medieval monarchs saw imperial precedent. Renaissance leaders saw classical grandeur. The form was adaptable because its core message was simple. Power should be seen. Seen power feels legitimate. Invisible power feels uncertain. That truth extends across time. But here is the deeper continuation. The Roman triumph was not only about rulers. It was about collective identity. When citizens gathered, they were not merely watching a general. They were witnessing themselves as part of something larger. Empire was not abstract during a triumph. It was embodied, in trophies, in captives, in treasure, in soldiers. The world was symbolically brought into the city. That physical concentration of distant conquest created emotional cohesion. Rome was not just a place. It was the center. That psychological centrality sustained expansion for centuries. But as geography stretched further, as communication slowed across distance, as local cultures maintained their own priorities, that central emotional gravity weakened. No ceremony, however grand, can permanently override distance. Distance changes loyalty. Distance reshapes identity. And when identity fragments, spectacle must work harder. Eventually, too hard. By late antiquity, triumph had become memory rather than expectation. The ritual that once celebrated new worlds became a reminder of old victories. Memory inspires pride. But it cannot replace momentum. And momentum, once lost, is difficult to restore. Yet even in decline, Rome's design remains instructive. Because it reveals an uncomfortable but enduring principle. Civilizations are sustained as much by perception as by power. If citizens believe in continuity, continuity strengthens. If they believe in decline, decline accelerates. The triumph managed perception masterfully during Rome's ascent. It struggled when material conditions contradicted the message. That contradiction is fatal for any system. Symbol must align with reality. When it does, ritual energizes. When it does not, ritual exposes fragility. So what remains at the absolute end of this long reflection? An image. A chariot rolling slowly along the Via Sacra. Crowds cheering. Incense rising. A general crowned. A slave whispering. And above it all, the understanding that glory and mortality are inseparable. That inseparability is Rome's deepest wisdom. Power dazzles. Time humbles. And wise systems remember both simultaneously. The Roman triumph did. For centuries. Until it could not. And that final phrase is not tragedy. It is inevitability. Because every civilization, no matter how grand, must eventually confront the same truth whispered behind the chariot. You are mortal. Your victories are mortal. Your monuments are mortal. Only the lessons endure. And perhaps that is why we have continued this exploration for so long. Not to relive the parade. But to understand the balance it tried to maintain. A balance between magnificence and restraint. Between ambition and order. Between eternity and the passing of time. The triumph ended. The empire ended. But the tension between glory and mortality remains. In every age. In every state. In every human system that dares to call itself enduring. After examining the structure, the politics, the psychology, the symbolism, and the evolution of the Roman triumph, one final dimension remains. The human experience inside it. Not the empire. Not the Senate. Not the emperor. But the individuals. Imagine the general the night before the procession. He knows tomorrow he will be elevated above every other citizen in Rome. He will wear garments associated with divinity. He will ride in a chariot like a living symbol. He will hear thousands chant his name. And yet, tradition reminds him it lasts only a day. One day at the summit. Then descent. That emotional arc must have been overwhelming. Triumph was not just spectacle. It was psychological compression. Years of campaign hardship distilled into a single public moment. Fear, exhaustion, ambition, pride, all converted into ritualized glory. But compression has consequences. When the mind experiences extreme elevation, returning to normalcy is difficult. For some, it reinforced loyalty to the system. For others, it awakened hunger for more. This is where figures like Julius Caesar become pivotal. Repeated triumphs reshape self-perception. Public adoration shifts identity. A man begins as a servant of the Republic. He ends believing the Republic requires him. That subtle shift changes history. And so the triumph was not just political engineering. It was identity engineering. It told a story not only to the crowd, but to the general himself. You are extraordinary. Even with the whispered reminder of mortality, the emotional impact must have been immense. Now imagine the crowd. Citizens who rarely left the city. Artisans, laborers, merchants, families. On Triumph Day, the world came to them. Exotic animals. Foreign prisoners. Gold and silver from distant lands. The empire materialized before their eyes. For many, it may have been the only tangible connection to territories they would never see. Triumph turned abstract geography into sensory experience. It strengthened pride. It strengthened belonging. It strengthened the idea that Rome was not just powerful, it was chosen. That collective feeling matters. Collective emotion is social glue. But it must be renewed. When victories slowed, renewal slowed. And when renewal slowed, pride became nostalgia. Nostalgia is powerful. But nostalgia looks backward. Empires require forward momentum. This emotional transition, from pride to nostalgia, may be one of the quiet turning points in Roman history. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Gradual. Almost invisible. By the time of Augustus, triumph had already begun shifting meaning. Under him, it became more centralized. More controlled. More associated with imperial authority than republican achievement. That shift stabilized Rome for generations. But it also concentrated emotional allegiance around a single figure. When institutions are strong, that works. When succession falters, it destabilizes. And succession was Rome's recurring challenge. Ritual can legitimize rule. It cannot guarantee smooth transfer. The triumph celebrated victory. It did not solve inheritance. And so, across centuries, Rome cycled through stability and crisis. Yet through all of it, the triumph remained a reference point, a memory of when the system felt coherent. Perhaps that is why later generations romanticized it. Because it symbolized clarity. Clear enemies. Clear victories. Clear hierarchy. Clear purpose. Later eras rarely feel so clear. Complexity replaces certainty. Defense replaces expansion. Internal debate replaces external conquest. In that environment, triumph feels like a relic of confidence. And confidence is contagious. So what is the final continuation, truly final this time? It is this. The Roman triumph reveals that civilizations are emotional organisms as much as political ones. They need affirmation. They need ceremony. They need shared moments of identity. But they also need restraint. They need humility. They need systems stronger than individuals. Rome managed this duality longer than most empires in history. That alone explains its enduring fascination. The triumph was not accidental excess. It was intentional balance. A day of godlike elevation framed by a reminder of mortality. Glory bordered by warning. Celebration bounded by law. When that balance held, Rome thrived. When it tipped too far toward individual dominance or institutional weakness, Rome struggled. And eventually, like all systems, it transformed. The chariot stopped. The arches weathered. The crowds vanished. But the design remains visible in stone, and in political rituals across the world. Because the tension between greatness and limitation is universal. Every society must decide how to celebrate success. Every leader must confront the intoxicating pull of admiration. Every system must guard against its own excess. The Roman triumph dramatized that tension more clearly than almost any ritual in history. And that is why we could continue speaking about it for hours, even days. Not because it was merely grand. But because it was honest. It admitted that power dazzles. It admitted that power tempts. And it admitted, through a whisper behind the chariot, that power is mortal. And perhaps the true triumph of Rome is not the parade itself, but the wisdom embedded within it. A wisdom that outlived the empire that created it. Because beyond politics, beyond spectacle, beyond architecture and symbolism, the Roman triumph ultimately confronts a question that every civilization must answer. What do we do with success? Success is destabilizing. Failure humbles, but success elevates. Elevation creates imbalance. And imbalance, if unmanaged, becomes collapse. The Roman triumph was Rome's answer to that dilemma. It said, we will celebrate, but within structure. We will elevate, but temporarily. We will glorify, but with a reminder of mortality. That design shows extraordinary self-awareness. Early Rome understood that ambition fuels greatness, yet unchecked ambition destroys equality. So they ritualized ambition. They gave it a stage, a costume, a script, and then they ended it. One day. That limit mattered. When a victorious commander passed through Rome in a chariot, crowned and adored, the entire system acknowledged his achievement. But the next morning, the system reclaimed equilibrium. The Republic resumed. Magistracies rotated. Debates continued. Power diffused again. That rhythm, elevation and return, was Rome's stabilizing heartbeat. But heartbeats can falter. When individuals like Julius Caesar stretched the boundaries of repetition, the rhythm changed. Repeated triumphs blurred the line between temporary glory and permanent authority. The ceremony, once a release valve, became a stepping stone. And once personal loyalty outweighs institutional loyalty, balance shifts. The Roman system adapted under Augustus by redefining permanence itself. Instead of resisting concentrated authority, it reorganized around it. The triumph no longer marked the peak of a citizen's career. It affirmed the supremacy of a ruler. That redefinition stabilized the empire for generations. But it also meant that the system's health became intertwined with individual competence. When strong emperors ruled, spectacle reinforced order. When weak or unstable rulers emerged, spectacle exposed fragility. Because ritual magnifies whoever stands at its center. If the center is strong, magnification inspires confidence. If the center is unstable, magnification amplifies doubt. That is the enduring structural lesson. The triumph was not inherently dangerous. It was a multiplier. And multipliers depend entirely on what they amplify. Now, step even further back. The Roman triumph reveals something universal about human societies. We need stories of success. We need visible moments where collective effort feels justified. We need symbols that translate sacrifice into meaning.